Started. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Trenton to his thesis defense today. I have the pleasure to work with a lot of students at the beginning. When you start with new PhD students, you start discussing about particular projects, ideas, and so on. One aspect that was distinguishing about Trenton is that he was in the driving seat from the very beginning. So basically, he said, "This is what I want to do, whether you like it or not." So basically, he was immediately running the show. He came up with a lot of ideas, probably worth 10 PhDs. I said, if you get to do, 1% of what you're saying, that would be amazing. He said, no, I'm going to do 20, whatever. Anyway, so he was clearly a person that showed immense creativity, initiative, drive from the very beginning of his PhD, and he delivered in working initially with Chinese Padawan, doing some work on trying to understand the basic architectures of transformers and other AI architectures, all the way to thinking about biological structures like the cerebellum and the role of sparseness and different types of neural networks and the theory and learning and continual learning, touching upon some of the fundamental discussions in the field in AI. It's been exciting for me to learn from him, probably more than I actually taught him during all these years. At some point, he realized that I didn't have a lot to teach him, so he said, I will establish a collaboration with people in California, and somewhere in between surfing in Costa Rica and flying to California. He established a collaboration with a friend of mine, Bruno Holzhausen there, and drove a whole new research program that culminated in a very nice paper in one of the top AI conferences in the field. And then at some point, he decided that he wanted to do an internship at Anthropic, at that point, one of the emerging companies in the AI world. I didn't quite appreciate at that time that was going to be a one-way road in some sense, but it was very exciting to see him also go there, thrive, and be one of the key people working on some of the foundational questions about interpretability in AI and neural networks. So it's been an exciting journey for me. I'm very, very glad to see you now defending your thesis, and I look forward to your presentation. After for those of you who don't know, this is the public part of the presentation, so he will tell us about his work. After that, you'll have some time to ask questions. Then we'll ask all of you to leave, except for the people in the thesis defense committee, and then we'll be bombarding him with more questions and evaluating him. And then after that, whether he passes or not, and I hope he will, but we'll have a reception in the kitchen down the corridor here in the fourth floor, so all of you are welcome. We brought food. I think that some other people brought food as well, so there will be plenty of food and drinks in the kitchen on the fourth floor. That will happen after the private defense, which happens after this initial presentation. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Yeah. I'll leave acknowledgments to the end, but yeah, Gabriel, thank you for everything. Okay, so the title of my thesis is Sparse Representations in Artificial and Biological Neural Networks. And at a high level, there's interesting sparsity in both deep learning models and the brain, and we'll get into some of that. So just at a high level, like, why should you care about any of this? And I'll try and have a why care section for each of the chapters that I summarize. So intelligence is a major reason why we aren't fighting tooth and nail on the savannah right now. But as important as intelligence is, we don't really understand how it works either in the brain or in AI models. And contrary to some opinions, AI models, at least the state-of-the-art ones that we use a lot today, are grown, not built. And one question you might ask then is, like, how similar are brains and AI models? And can we learn anything about one from the other? And so my thesis centers around the concept of sparsity as a core concept that appears both in AIs and brains and can be used both to improve AI in a couple ways that we'll try and get into, and to test neuroscience theories, to maybe have better indicators for, is this what's going on in the brain or not? So I'll do a quick high-level summary of the 4 different chapters of the thesis that we'll try to get through. Hopefully there's enough time. So the first chapter looks at there's this surprising 3-way convergence between a theoretical model for how memory works, the cerebellum, and large language models like ChatGPT and Claude. The second extends this work by taking extra ideas from the cerebellum and uses that to make AI less forgetful. The third shows that when you add noise, when you're training some of these models, it can make them more sparse and brain-like. And the fourth takes a brain-inspired algorithm and applies it to Claude, one of the large language learning models, and enables us to start to decode its thoughts. Okay, so chapter 1, the title of it is Attention Approximates Sparse Distributed Memory, and why should you care about this chapter? So as I alluded to before, there's this interesting, surprising, inadvertent 3-way convergence between this mathematical model for how memories are stored, that's called sparse distributed memory, the circuit that's kind of the core of the cerebellum, which I think is a very underrated brain region, and the attention algorithm and transformers, which was kind of the key breakthrough in 2017 that led to Claude, ChatGPT, everything that we're seeing now. So a big picture you can kind of ask from this convergence is, does Claude work in any ways that are similar to the human brain and vice versa? So I'll quickly go through what we mean by thoughts and memories and just try to like set the scene, especially for people without a neuroscience background. I'm then going to give an explanation for sparse distributed memory. I'll then give an explanation for transformer attention and show how the two of them are actually more similar than otherwise meets the eye. Okay, so what is a thought? I'm going to say that a thought is a unique pattern of neurons firing in the brain. And say that you're like looking at this image of a tiger. This causes certain neurons in different brain regions to fire. So here we have a brain, we have a bunch of different regions of the brain, and those are first creating edges and lines, then shapes, then objects, and then more meaningful objects like faces. And one way that we can represent a pattern of neuron activity, so this is a region of the brain with neurons and the pink ones are lit up, is as we can kind of flatten all of them into this big list, and we can summarize if they're active or not by zeros and ones. And so when we think about a brain region lighting up, we can kind of think of this vector or long list of activity that represents a specific thought in the brain. And a memory is just a thought that's stored somehow inside neurons so that it can later produce the same or a different pattern of neural activity that leads to whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. Okay, so how does sparse distributed memory work? Well, originally, it was a pure theoretical, how can I store memories in a system that has high memory capacity, that is robust to noise, that is biologically plausible, and is also that fault tolerant. So if neurons die, it's okay. And Pentti came up with this. He wrote down this set of equations. I'm not going to get into the math here. We can if we have time at the end. But he wrote out this set of equations for what kind of like an optimal memory system might be. Later on, it was discovered that this system actually has striking similarities to the cerebellum. So this is how you implement sparse distributed memory as a circuit. And again, this is more of just a teaser, but I'm trying to give context. And it turns out that you can map it very cleanly onto the core neuron types and operations in the cerebellum. This is not proven to be true, but this is a theory for how the cerebellum might work. And the correspondences and the requirements match up in a pretty cool way. And here's kind of the wiring of the cerebellum, which again is I'm just trying to give a flavor here. Okay, so I have this analogy for how SDM works. We're going to see how it goes. You can think of Mormons about to go on a mission trip. And so Mormons from around the world gather to be assigned the country they're going to travel to. And this is not an ordinary mission assignment. Instead of being randomly assigned, each Mormon fills out a form where they list their preferences, and there's 100 of them. If they like spicy food, if they like pineapple on pizza, these sorts of things. Okay, now we're going to announce each country. And every Mormon is going to check, does the country and its traits match more than 90 of my preferences? There's this threshold. Out of 100, does it match 90 of them? And if yes, then they add that country to a list of countries that they might travel to. And specifically, they add the GPS coordinates of that country. Okay, now the kicker is that once they've assigned every country, they take that list and they average the GPS coordinates of every country that they might travel to. And they have to travel to the location that is the exact average. So if it's in the ocean, too bad. That's where you have to travel to. So I have this like map, and here are some countries that someone matched with, and they need to travel to the middle of the ocean, right in between, which is the average. Okay, so this is, I'll break down how this corresponds to sparse distributed memory. So every Mormon is a neuron, and every neuron has a fixed location in the brain, which is the preferences that that Mormon has. And then every country is a memory that we're trying to store, and you're seeing if it matches with over 90 of the traits, in which case you add it to your list. Now, neurons have a finite capacity, so they can't store separate information for every country. They need to just have this average of all of the countries that they've matched with as the GPS coordinates they're going to. Now, how do we read from this memory system? How is this useful? Okay, so back in the Mormon missionary assignment hall, the president of the church decides he wants to vacation to France, but instead of consulting a map, he's going to use the missionaries. So he lists off the 100 traits for France. He brings together all the Mormons that matched with over 90 of them, and he collects their final coordinates. Now, these coordinates shouldn't be useful on the surface because it's an average of everything that they matched with.
Okay.
But in reality, he can actually take all of those separate coordinates, and by averaging those, find the location of France. And the reason why this works is because the common denominator for that subset of Mormons that matched, that had more than 90 preferences, was that they all matched with France. So all of the other countries that they might have matched with will kind of cancel out. And the thing that they had the most in common was wherever France was on the map. So you could say that the memory of France's location was distributed over a sparse number of neurons. Only a handful of the neurons, those that had over a 90 out of 100 preferences match, that memory was stored inside them. And this is why we call it sparse distributed memory. You're writing to only a few things and in a distributed fashion, and then you can read back in this distributed way. Okay, so now we're going to go through this pictorially, and this is kind of key to showing the relationship with attention. So each of these hollow circles is a neuron or a Mormon. And the green thing here is a memory that we're activating the nearby neurons of. And so this is kind of the 90 preference match. So here we show by the dot being inside the circle that that memory is being stored by those neurons. And I'm keeping track as well of the original location of the memory, which is the green hollow circle. Okay, now we're storing a second memory or country in this case. And again, we're writing it in. And note that some of the neurons here now have both a green and an orange dot. That means that they're storing both. And again, they're kind of doing an average of what was being stored there. Okay, now we're writing in a third, and that's stored as well. And again, the original location of the country's gone. It's only stored as a triangulation of the nearby neurons that have that information inside of it. Okay, so here is the president of the church. He's trying to figure out where France is. He's the purple star, or the pink star. He'll activate nearby neurons, and then they will all share their final information, which is this average, and use that to figure out the location. Here, France is the blue dots, and the most blue dots appear inside the circles that get activated, which is kind of why you get this update into the direction of France. Okay, so in order to relate this to attention, you actually need to now forget about the neurons. Like those are behind the scenes storing the information, but they're only intermediaries for the intersection of two circles. The circle where you originally wrote the memory in, which are all these hollow blue, orange, green, and then the pink star, which is where you're now trying to ask, okay, where's the location of France? And so you have these different circle intersections, and the size of that circle intersection is how much you update in that particular direction with that information, right? So again, the Mormon president activates the most Mormons who corresponded with France, and that's why you're updating the most towards France. Also, if anyone needs to stop for questions, I'm happy to take them whenever. I should have said that earlier. Okay, let me just get some water. Ooh. Okay, so at a high level, that's how sparse distributed memory works. I'll give a brief overview of attention now, relating it to the Mormons again. And I guess I'm throwing around transformers here, and I'm throwing around attention. When you hear transformer, think Claude, think ChatGPT, think state-of-the-art AI models. So attention was developed in 2017. It was kind of a big unlock for neural networks to learn much more efficiently, and led to a lot of the progress that we're seeing now. So we're back with the president of the Church of Latter-day Saints trying to visit France. Instead of having all of our Mormon missionaries that were assigned to a bunch of different countries, we've now flown in a representative from every country who is perfectly aligned with that country, okay? And they know the exact GPS coordinates. And so the president now does the same as before. He lists off 100 traits for France. He's trying to visit it. But this time, instead of taking only the Mormons that matched with 90 locations, 90 of the preferences, he's going to collect a location for every single Mormon representative in the room, but he's going to do a weighted average. So instead of just combining all of their locations equally, he's going to upweight the Mormons that had a higher match with the list of traits for France. And so, again, here's what SDM's doing, where we care about these circle intersections. And here's what attention's doing, where instead we consider every original memory location, but we're going to weight them differently. And we're going to work with the memories directly. We're not going to bother with these neuron intermediaries that store like a distributed version of it. And so the reason why this works is, again, you're weighting the ones that are closer more. And this is what we call the softmax function in AI, which puts a lot of weight on things that are nearby. Here's what the equation looks like. It's an exponential over a sum of exponentials. And I just have this example here where we have 4 inputs, and they have different values on the y-axis. And if you took an ordinary average so that they all sum to 1, you get the orange bars here. But instead, if you take a softmax, you weight the things that are large, the things that are closer, more than you otherwise would. So see how this green bar for input 4 is much larger, and this input 1, which had like a really small value, is now basically at 0. And so you're functionally like only considering the things that are actually close to you. And so the core reason why sparse distributed memory and attention can be related is because this softmax function closely approximates the circle intersection that sparse distributed memory uses. And just to show that, so on the left here, we have 2 of those circles in sparse distributed memory. And on the right, on the x-axis, we're varying how far away those circles are. And on the y-axis, we're showing how many neurons are in that intersection. And the fact this is a straight line on this plot with a y-axis that's logged shows that you have this exponential drop-off in the same way that the softmax function was operating. And so I'm trying to stay away from equations in this talk. We can get into it in the appendix, but on the left here is the attention equation for transformers that's split out into the softmax. And this is a close approximation to when you plug in the circle intersection operation for sparse distributed memory. And here we just show 2 different settings, which are quite realistic for transformers. And the orange dots are transformer attention and how much weight it's applying to each of the memories it could consider. And the blue is sparse distributed memory, where you're using neurons and seeing how many neurons are in this circle intersection. And you can see that for the values, they track very nicely with each other. And if you're very attentive, you might see this log plot here, which shows some deviation. But what's critical is that that deviation happens only when things are really far apart. And so they're never getting that much weight to begin with. What matters is that there's high agreement for these larger values, the things that are near. Okay, that's the end of chapter 1. Any questions? Yeah.
This is a really cool model, and that's like helpful to help me understand it. But the cerebellum isn't necessarily intelligence per se, right? How do you think that this model of cerebellum generalizes onto, I guess, the newer regions of the brain?
Yeah. I didn't get to finish this work, but I was like pretty excited about trying to map the cerebellum and its similarities onto other brain structures. So it might be the case, and Sam, who's probably the most real neuroscientist in the room, in addition to Gabriel, would probably like cringe at me saying that the cerebellum might have a similar algorithm to cortical columns across the cortex, basal ganglia, hippocampus, like a few different regions. The algorithm is so simple, right? It's literally just write to neurons that are nearby, read from neurons that are nearby. And just by doing that, you get what approximates the state-of-the-art AI model. So it's pretty plausible that it's also working there. I would also just put in a quick pitch for the cerebellum. I mean, it's 80% of the neurons in the brain, give or take, which most people don't know. It's like, it's small, it's underappreciated, and the neurons there are small, but it has a huge metabolic cost. It's also one of the oldest brain regions, so even fruit flies have the exact same cognitive structure in their mushroom body. Yeah. Okay, chapter 2. So we build on the first chapter now and bring in extra components from the cerebellum. And this actually makes dumb AI models, like small models, this doesn't apply to Claude or other things, much better at continual learning. So they forget tasks less often. Okay. So, and this is like, people will say that it's really hard to use ideas from neuroscience to improve AI, and that's totally correct. And this project was like, it was pretty hard to get neuroscience to improve AI, and I think, again, it doesn't apply to the big AI models, but it was still fun to like actually get a win here. Okay, so AI is really bad at remembering information when you train it on multiple different tasks. So say you first teach it geography and then you teach it history, it will forget the geography. And the reason it forgets the geography is because it's really messy in how it memorizes things. It just kind of memorizes, like dumps the information everywhere. I have a nice visual here. Okay, so this is like your memory storage, and each of these colors are like a different memory that you've written out. And there's a bunch of overlap between the colors. It looks really messy. So by default, if you train a small AI model, it will store memories like this. And then when you teach it new facts, it will just overwrite them and forget the thing from before. It turns out that if you introduce some of these ideas from the cerebellum, from sparse distributed memory, that you can actually encourage your memories to be stored in much more siloed, clean modules that aren't overwritten anywhere near as often. And this is thanks to sparsity. So I'm first going to relate sparse distributed memory to multi-layered perceptrons, which is kind of this like very basic AI model these days in deep learning. Then I'll talk about how we improve sparse distributed memory by taking some components from the cerebellum. And then I'll show how it leads to better memorization in AI models. And so at a high level, what's also cool about this work is the first chapter relates sparse distributed memory to attention. And the second chapter relates it to what we call multi-layered perceptrons. And these are the two core building blocks of transformers, which power Claude. And the transformer literally is just these two modules repeated over and over and over again. And I guess one other high level thing, you can think of attention as like a short-term memory, and the things I'm going to be talking about now is like a long-term memory, but both with relations to SDM. Okay, so a couple equations here, things are going to get a little bit more technical, but hopefully still understandable. This is the equation for SDM, and this inner bracket here is the neuron, the Mormon matching. So it's like, how well does a given neuron match with the input? This is how, when we add the B component in here, it's which neurons clear that matching threshold of 90 over 100. And then this is the list of countries that the Mormons accumulated for like what information should we take from those neurons that match. And it turns out that the multi-layered perceptron is very similar to this. You're using vectors that aren't L2 normalized, and you can use different activation functions, but it's quite similar. And again, I think this is more of just like a teaser for things that are in the paper that I don't have time to get into now. So there's a problem with SDM if you do this mapping to MLPs, which is that it assumes memories are random and evenly spread throughout memory space. So going back to the Mormons, assume that all the Mormons don't list out their preferences. They're just randomly assigned them, and that every country is like totally random as well. And this is obviously wrong. Mormons and traits of countries will cluster together in different meaningful ways. But that's a problem for the memory system because certain neurons will be overloaded and others will be underutilized. So here I have all my neurons on this manifold, which is kind of the squiggly line, and we have 2 memories. And the green one is writing out to 5 neurons, but the orange one is only writing out to 1 neuron. And so that neuron that's storing 5 is going to get overloaded. So Keeler back in 1988 realized this and instead changed the algorithm a little bit. So instead of checking if you have 90 out of 100 matches, instead every country gets assigned to K Mormons who have the highest matches. So every neuron now gets written to the same thing. I just picked that with the orange here. See how the orange circle is much bigger? It's expanding its threshold. It's being more generous. You don't have to match with 90. Maybe you only have to match with 80 now. So that every single neuron, every memory gets stored to only 3 neurons, exactly 3 neurons. And so this is called the top K activation function, or K winner takes all. And it can actually be implemented by an inhibitory interneuron. So in this case, we have a bunch of excitatory neurons, and you can think of the inhibitory interneuron as like a central regulator that says, okay, too many are on, a few of you need to turn off. Okay, yep, this is roughly the right number. And again, this is an approximation. I'm not saying this is exactly what inhibitory interneurons do, but it's one way to think of them. So if you just apply this algorithm, you get a bunch of dead neurons that are never activated. And because like the neurons start off randomly initialized, and then a few of them are, you could think of as like greedy almost. They're just always turning on. And so what you actually have to do is you gradually have to introduce the K value. And I add this in because it's a really fun piece of biology, where in the brain, imagine all your neurons are randomly initialized to start with, and then all of the data you're getting is only activating a few of them. Like, how do the other neurons begin to learn where to go in the space, how to be active? And it turns out that GABA, which is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter and turns things off, actually starts off being really excitatory. And every neuron will activate, it's going to learn, it's going to move on to the data manifold. And then once it's activated enough times, then it swaps out its receptors, so then it starts being inhibited. And this is just a really cool piece of biology. So how does sparse distributed memory help with forgetting? This is a complicated slide, but it's basically, we take images, and there are 10 different categories for the images. So it's like dogs, fish, birds, and we train the model on only 2 of them. And then we train it on a separate 2, and then a separate 2, and then a separate 2. And we see how much information it remembers when we do that sort of training. And so, and what's really cool about this compared to other techniques that people have tried in the past is that the model just naturally learns to assign memories to different categories. It doesn't need to be told this category is different from this category, is different from this category. And so here we compare a baseline to sparse distributed memory, and I want you to first pay attention to this blue dotted line, and you can see the model learns task 1, which is this first black vertical bar, and then the second it goes to task 2, it just completely forgets what it was doing with task 1. And same with the other bars that are dotted here. For each task, the model will learn it and then immediately forget it when it's later tested. Versus when you implement sparse distributed memory, you get this gradual forgetting, but not a total catastrophic overwrite with each new task that you learn. So again, like this dark blue here, that was the task 1, and you can see that the blue line drops over time, but it doesn't go all the way to 0. It still stays quite high. And so here's another way of looking at this. Instead of forgetting, this is just overall performance. And sparse distributed memory, or it with a combination, has this like stair step performance where it keeps learning each new task and does better, better, better. And a bunch of other baselines just kind of have a spike where they learn the new task and then they forget it and they stay around 0.2, which is performance on only one of the tasks. Yeah.
What is combo in this circumstance?
Yeah, so it's sparse distributed memory with a weight importance metric. So this is like SDM leads to sparsity, and then the weight importance helps you say like how you should learn within that task. But you can stack the different approaches together and it will lead to better performance.
I have a question. What's the purple one for you?
The purple is ReLU, which just means like a default network.
Oh.
Yeah, so you like haven't tried to do any modifications here. And I guess another thing I should point out, the orange bar is top K. So I was talking on and on about top K. I left out a number of other modifications that sparse distributed memory says you need to make to get good performance. If you just do top K, it's not good. And a number of those modifications were directly predicted by SDM. Like it would have been too hard for me to just like make them up or like do all those modifications without being guided by this relationship. And so at a high level, the reason this works is one, you have top K, so only a few neurons are ever active and updating. And then two, and I didn't get into this too much, but you have to normalize everything and avoid what are called bias terms so that none of the neurons become too greedy. And they're all able to like participate in learning in a democratic way. I'll skip that slide. Here, what's also fun is like you can see the specialization to different tasks. So I said it learns like birds and fish and cats and dogs. If you look at the neurons, a number of them look like fuzzy versions of the underlying image. So you can like, it's super low density or low resolution, but you can kind of see like a bird outline in like the middle left and like, I think a horse or a deer in the top left and a frog in the far right, top right. All right, any more questions? Yeah.
How do you set what K is, both artificially and do you know how the brain does it? Like how does it affect performance?
Yeah, it definitely matters. SDM has different predictions if you assume everything's random for like what value it should be to get the best memory performance versus handle the most noise. So you can vary those values. In practice, we just set it to be quite small. So if we had 1,000 neurons, maybe 10 could be active at any time, and tried a few different values. Yeah. All right, chapter 3. Emergence of sparse representations from noise. So brains are really sparse, like very few neurons fire at any time. In most brain regions, not all. AI models naturally like have a lot of neuron activity. So why is there a difference here? And does that difference matter? Commonly people say, oh, well, the brain is sparse because it's very expensive for neurons to fire. And so it has to be sparse, while with AI, it doesn't really matter. And so the alternative that we kind of present through this work is that the brain chooses to be sparse because it's the best way to handle noise. And so it turns out that if you just inject noise into the model, then it will automatically learn something that looks very like the top K operation. You don't need to tell it to do that. And this is actually like the best way for it to handle noise. And so this kind of makes sense too, in that the world is a really noisy place. And so adding noise into the AI model just makes it learn in a way that would be similar to the way that the brain learns. And yeah, so I'll first just show empirically, like, yes, this is what we see. And then I'll try to give a theoretical explanation for why. So here's kind of the setup. We have this image of a frog. We're adding noise to it. And then we put the noisy image of the frog into the AI model and we ask it to remove the noise. So we could just train on the frog, but we're making the task more difficult by adding this noise. And here's just more flavor of this, like the original image is on the far left, and then we're adding different amounts of noise, and then trying to reconstruct the original image. And you can see that performance gets much worse as we go to the right and add more noise to the images. But honestly, it's still pretty good. Like if you gave me this image, there's no way I could reconstruct that it had anything. It looked anything like the original. And so this is kind of the main result. We have the fraction of neurons that are active on the y-axis, and we have training on the x-axis. And
think that
the lines going down
Kathy and
correspond to
Sander
adding more noise
were
when you're
on the-
training. So at the very top here is no noise, and it's like 80% of neurons are active at any given time. But if we add like 10 standard deviations of noise, this is like a Gaussian distribution, then you can see over time the number of neurons drops off dramatically to be like 5% are active at any given time. So it's a pretty striking result. And what's really cool about this is that the neurons naturally like synchronize amongst themselves so that only 10 will be on at a given time. Because that does take coordination. And so here I have 3 different noise amounts and the active neurons, which is the same slide as before. Here I'm showing the neuron bias terms. So this is like a default value that needs to be passed for the neuron to decide to fire or not. And you can see as you add more noise, 2 things happen. One, those bias terms drop and become very negative. So in order for these neurons to activate, you can think of it like I need to input a value of more than 0.5 for the neurons to become active. But what's also striking is that in the top figure, the bias terms are very distributed. And in the bottom figure, they all like synchronize to almost like a specific value. And it turns out that you can actually replace all of their separate thresholds with a single one, and it doesn't affect performance because they've like agreed this is the value that we're going to use. They also synchronize a lot on how sensitive they are to inputs. And so you'll see that convergence here too. And so this means, again, for any given input, like only some number of them are going to be active. And so why do neurons choose to be sparse when you start injecting noise? At a high level, noise is bad and messes up what a neuron should be doing. And in particular, the worst thing that can happen to a neuron is it didn't want to fire and all of a sudden it's forced to fire, or vice versa. It really wanted to fire and all of a sudden now it's off. And so the best ways to resist noise are to do 3 things, and we kind of derive these 3 additional loss terms. And what I mean by a loss term here is like you're training the model to remove noise or to like predict frogs. And that's the thing that you care about. But when you add noise, you're actually telling the model to care about 3 extra things. So one of those is, and like the way to satisfy that is to fire as little as possible. Because if you're totally off, then the noise can't affect you, right? You just won't respond to it. Secondly, if you do fire really strongly so that noise can't accidentally switch you off. You're like fully committing. And then finally, be independent from other neurons, because if you fire for similar things and the noise activates you, then that noise is just going to be propagated even more. And so here are those 3 things again in more of a pictorial way. So the neuron first wants to specialize its weight, so it's doing something unique. So here I have an image of a truck, and this is actually what the neuron is looking for, this like stripy white and black thing, which we can call an edge detector. So like this neuron is just looking for edges at the bottom of an image that go horizontal. Secondly, we want the neuron to be off most of the time. So this blue is a distribution for what the neuron's doing across lots of different images, and it's like very comfortably really negative. And then if it is going to fire, it wants to maximize the margin around this 0 threshold where it's either on or off. And so it wants to be really, really active. So this is in theory, but when we test it empirically, we see the same thing. So top left is only a little noise, right is more noise, and then bottom is even more noise. And so first we see the activity shifting left. And so this is 250 neurons across like a whole bunch of different inputs. How active is each neuron? What does that distribution of activity look like? And so first thing you see is you see a leftward shift that gets larger and larger. And secondly, you see the tails widen. So especially in this last image here. And this corresponds to wanting to, like, if you're going to fire, you want to fire a lot. Really go for it. And now we're looking at some of those neurons. So I already talked about the one that looks at the bottom of a truck. And you see a lot more that are either edge detectors or these dots, which are center surround receptive fields. And we see these in different regions of the human visual cortex. So these actually look kind of like what the brain is doing when it's processing images. And again, these just emerge naturally. And like, so here I just have a bunch of different neurons, and you can see like this is a little amount of noise, and the neurons just look like almost totally random patterns. And then as we add more noise, so this is like 0.8, you start to see a bunch of these different dots appear and these stripy lines. And again, all you're doing is injecting noise and the model's like calibrating itself and becoming sparse and specializing in a way that looks very human-like. And then a fun thing too is you can just change the training dynamics of the model. And so in this case, we add noise at the start and then we remove it. And we see, does the model then become dense again? And it doesn't. It chooses to remain much sparser than it otherwise would, right? So like if we look at this brown line, which ends up in the bottom right at the very bottom, it started off with half of the neurons being active. And by the end of training, even after we totally remove noise, it's still like 5–10% of neurons are only active at any given time, versus staying at 50% or even higher when we never used noise. Any questions? Yeah.
Previous graph.
Yeah.
Were you training with the activation functions you use for all of these?
Yeah, so here, so all the results I presented are ReLU. We do ablate with a number of other activation functions. And I have it in the appendix. I moved it out of the main figures, but in every case, you see the model choose to be in the 0 gradient region of its activation function, which corresponds to, I really don't want noise to perturb me in any way.
Is there simulation on how it works when you move the point where you start the engine?
When we start and remove
Yeah.
noise? Not a ton. It was more, one thing that is key is you want to gradually remove the noise. If you all of a sudden just get rid of it, you can kind of think of it from the manifold perspective I was talking about earlier with like dead neurons, where if all your data exists on my hand, and you're adding noise so that instead all the data exists out here, you'll have neurons that are specializing kind of at the boundaries of my hands here. And if all of a sudden you shrink back to just my hand, all the neurons out here will kind of be like left in isolation. So you kind of want to gradually shrink the space back so they can move back inwards. And this is a good slide that I skipped. But this is one way to think of it. So like the blue points here are the data, and the orange points are your neurons. And you can see that they've learned to spread across the whole space of the data, kind of specialize to different parts of that. Cool. Yep.
So we've seen an example of noise for images. Could you tell us a little bit about noise in other domains and how that might be expressed? For example, like text.
Yeah, that's a good question. With text, you could really aggressively just change words randomly. You could also add noise at the first layer of the model. So after it's converted text, which is obviously like discrete, into some representation inside, you could mess with that neuron activity a bit. Yeah. And we do experiments for that with transformers, with AlexNet, with some deeper models that are in the paper. Okay, last chapter. So it's called Towards Monosemanticity. We're decomposing language models with dictionary learning. So why should you care? Again, AI is grown, not built. And this means that we lack a good understanding of what it's actually thinking about, what it's actually doing. One weird analogy for how we train AI models currently is that we take a 5-year-old, like a very early unformed brain, and then we lock that 5-year-old in a room for 100 years and just have it read the internet that entire time. And then we bring the 105-year-old out, we teach them a few table manners, and then we need to figure out, can we trust this 5-year-old? What is it thinking? What has it learned? What does it believe about the world? What are its goals? And this analogy maps onto, first we take an AI model, we literally just have it read the internet for a huge amount of time. And then we train it on human preferences so that it uses bullet points instead of lists and acts nice with humans. But there could actually be a lot going on behind the scenes here. And so ideally we can figure out what it's actually thinking. The problem is if you open up the box here and look at the neurons, it doesn't work because every neuron ends up firing for 1,000 different things. And we need a way to translate this mess into clean components we can understand. One analogy is imagine that you have a box of Christmas tree lights that you're taking out for the next holiday, and they're just all tangled up. It's a total mess. You can't make sense of it. And we want to try and apply an algorithm so that we can untangle these Christmas lights into neat rows that we can understand. And so we developed an algorithm which was inspired by an algorithm for how the brain processes images, actually, called sparse coding, to make some progress towards opening up this black box. And this is applied specifically to state-of-the-art AI models like Claude, ChatGPT, but the theory behind this, why it works, I think applies to lots of deep learning models in general, and potentially also the brain. And there's some exciting work now with like others applying this to neural data in the brain. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about these things called sparse autoencoders, which is the algorithm that we use, and then do a bit of a tour through the features that we actually find in the model. And okay, so the reason why, I'm going to talk first about like what we call monosemanticity versus polysemanticity. And so this just means a neuron fires for thousands of things. Now, back, Gabriel, how many years ago? 20 years ago, 30 years ago? 100 years ago? Gabriel was involved in some work where they found a Jennifer Aniston neuron. And so this was a neuron that seemed to only light up for Jennifer Aniston in a bunch of different concepts, and was very specific. But aside from the Jennifer Aniston neuron, most neurons activate for lots of different things. And it's really hard to then make sense of what's going on. And so we say that neurons are polysemantic instead of monosemantic, which would mean for a single concept. And AI is the same as the brain here. And so here's just an example where we're looking at a neuron in a large language model. And I've highlighted in red different examples of text that it fires on. So we've got like command line code, we've got Chinese, we've got you need a second TiVo, smoking duration or generally not. Like there's just so many things that this neuron's active for, it's really hard to make sense of or summarize what it's actually doing. And so I want to give some high-level intuition here for why this is happening. Make a list in your head right now, don't actually, but of everything that you could be seeing in front of you right now, in front of your eyes. Like what are all the possible things that could exist right here? And then highlight or the things that are actually in front of you. And the list of things that could be existing in front of you is really, really long or really high dimensional. And the things that are actually in front of you is very sparse. Like of all possible things, very few of them are in front of you right now. And so the claim is that this list of possible things is actually longer than the number of neurons that are in your brain. And so in order to process everything that could be on that list, you need your neurons to multitask. And it's great they can multitask because there are only a few things that they actually need to juggle, that they actually need to deal with at any one time. But all the neurons need to be able to process so many possible things. You can't have this like one-to-one assignment or lookup table. Yeah.
I'm curious about the implications of that. So let's say, for example, you put like an infant in a black box and you only show it like a photo of a rubber duck. So all it ever knows is like a photo of a rubber duck. That's the only thing that exists.
Yeah.
Would that mean that like all of its neurons would encode to just be like rubber duck photo? And let's, or maybe you made that 5 things. Would that mean that you have more neurons than the things.
Yeah.
Picture in front of it?
It's a great question. I mean, it's one cop-out answer is that like early visual processing will break it into patterns and lines, and then later reconstruct into the image of the duck. It also, yeah, you'd need like 5 things because otherwise, like everything would just always light up for duck. It had only seen duck. I mean, I don't know exactly what it would look like, but I would claim it would be much easier to understand what's going on in that brain. Or if you gave me 2 infants and one of them had only seen this and one had seen the whole world, and you had access to their brains and you were like, what have they seen about the world? That brain would look very different, I think. But yeah, it's a great question. Okay, so polysemanticity hates to see sparse autoencoders coming. I've talked about how, I'm just gonna go to this slide. Okay, so I've talked about how the real world is like really high dimensional and sparse. And then we have this AI model, or you could think of it as even the brain, which is lower dimensional and needs to find a way to compress all this information down and then ultimately produce outputs. And our algorithm tries to reverse this high dimensional thing into low dimensional thing and go back to some higher dimensional space. And so the way that we do that is through dictionary learning, or what we also call sparse autoencoders, where we take a sliver of the model, we take the neuron activations there, and we learn how to map it to this much higher dimensional space with the hope that in doing that, we can relearn kind of what the original high dimensional underlying things that are going on are, but in a way where there's a much cleaner mapping for what the neurons are actually doing. And so here's one case of this. So now I'm kind of looking at just this sliver in red here. So we have the neuron activations inside our AI model, and we're mapping it to this much higher dimensional space, which we call feature activations. And there are only two things that we want this to do. One, we want it to reconstruct the thing that was first given. So I'm seeing these values of -0.8, 0.4. I want to map them to this space, and then I want them to map back to the original thing. The second thing I want to do is I want to make this sparse. So of these, I don't know, 8 different dimensions, let's say only 2 of them can ever be active at a given time. So reconstruct what I'm giving you and do it with very few resources in an efficient way. That's it. We don't tell it what to learn. We don't tell it what's in the model. It's just carve up the space and into things that are only active every once in a while. And for people familiar with PCA, principal components analysis, this is different because PCA reduces the number of dimensions you have, right? I give you 100 dimensions, you need to compress it into 10. We're actually doing the reverse, right? So it's like, I give you 2 dimensions, you can turn it into 8, but you need to do it in a way where only a few of them are being used at any given time. And so we apply this to single layer transformers in this paper. In work sense, we've scaled it up to Claude, like the entire model, and have even found like circuits instead of single features. But this was the first work where we find features in these models. And okay, so I'm saying we find like features of what the model is actually thinking or doing. How do I know that? How do I make that claim? The first is we run a ton of inputs through the model and we see when the feature we find fires. And the second is that we activate the feature artificially and we see what effect it has on the model downstream. So let me just get into some of these features. So, and in this paper, we've learned up to 64,000 different features from the model. And so one of the ones that we find seems to fire for DNA. And so on the x-axis here is how active was the feature. And the y-axis is like how many examples we saw at that level of activity. And we have some examples on the top here. And when the feature is most active, it's always firing for all caps nucleotides or DNA strings. And so the red and blue here are when the feature was active or not. And then we tried to learn a proxy to like parse out, is the thing it's firing for DNA or not? And it turned out that in the examples where our proxy and the feature disagreed, the feature was actually more accurate than the proxy. So the feature is like really firing nicely for DNA and not other things, or things that a proxy might say. And if we artificially activate the feature, it also just predicts that DNA will continue. DNA will come next. And I like this next visual here, where we give the AI model a list, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 10. And then if we do no intervention, it's a really dumb model, so it actually doesn't complete the list. It goes like 8, 30, 20, 8. But if instead you steer it with one of these features that we found, like the DNA feature, instead of completing the list, it all of a sudden just spits out DNA strings. And we have a whole bunch of other examples here where we find like a Han Chinese feature, uppercase, Arabic, Hebrew, where it suddenly switches what it's doing to this new thing that we found. And if you look at the closest neuron in the model, it has nothing to do with DNA. Like you can see some uppercase, so maybe it picks up uppercase a little bit, but there's just all sorts of other things that it's firing for that we can't really make sense of. So the algorithm's clearly helping us disentangle what's going on. So some more features. This one we find, and you can kind of look on the right here for a visualization of what it's active for. I won't go through the rest of this like feature visualization. It's finding for numbers after 3-ish new lines. So it's like new line, 19, or 26. Here's one that's 2-digit numbers in scientific contexts, predicting various units. So like 20 with Celsius, or like milliliters, voltage, so firing for scientific numbers. And look, if we see like what is it up weighting, like the 30 fires, and then it predicts that the next word should be like one of these scientific metrics.
Blue, if you can see my cursor here.
Here's one that fires for climate change. Yeah.
I'm curious in that case, let's say you did the feature steering like in previous slides. Would it only output the numbers, or would it output also the character that associates it with like a scientific context?
So I think it would see the list, and then it would output one of these things. So it would output like microliters or milliliters or any of these other metrics. Yeah, and probably just repeat it. Here's one for climate change. So it fires on like phrases that talk about not just reducing carbon pollution, hour of electricity generated, reduce CO2. And again, if we were to steer with it, we'd see words like emissions, renewable, greenhouse, pollution, coal, fossil. So there's some pattern of activity that corresponds to all of these things related to climate change. Here's one for food reviews. Okay. What's really cool as well is the features we find, you can create clusters. So we're mapping them onto this like 2D space, and they cluster quite well. There's one for Japanese all the way out here. And on the paper, there's like an interactive visualization where you can like zoom in, zoom out, this sort of thing. And you can also, if you go to the paper, you can see all the features yourself and like browse through this interface. That's why there's screenshots from it. And what's really cool as well is, say that we learn, so we map our space up to like 500 dimensions, learn 500 features. Instead, we map it up to 10,000 dimensions, learn 10,000 features. There's a phenomenon called feature splitting. So if I map up to 500 dimensions, maybe I have a single feature for food. But if I instead map to 10,000 dimensions, I'll have multiple different types of food that are all split out. And so that's what this diagram here is showing, where in the gray is the really coarse 500 features. And then in the green here is the 16,000 features that are all existing in like very similar parts of the space. So it's kind of doing this like ever more fine splitting of these concepts. So here's like a pictorial representation where we have like one arrow here versus like 3 arrows that are all pointing in the same space, in the same direction. And here's another instance where on the far left here is like we only have 512 features. And so we have some for like mathematical terminology. And then as you split it more and more, you get like very specific types of math that are firing for this sort of thing. Okay, last cool thing. We see some instances of finite state automata. And so this is a case where like a feature will activate itself again and again and again. So like the DNA one is a good example where it sees DNA, it activates, it predicts DNA, it sees more DNA, it activates again and again. And then we have these two-way ones. So this is like variable names and coding. So one of the features fires for all caps and it predicts an underscore. And then the underscore fires and it predicts different words that would be variable names. Here we have some for like multi-token Unicode languages, so Tamil and Chinese, well, they'll predict like the ending part of the Chinese token. This one's really fun. This is for an Ubuntu chat forum, or like online chat forums in general, where one of them fires for the open angle bracket in a username, and then it fires for the username, and then it does a close angle bracket for the username, and then it predicts like, yeah, hey, hello, and then Ubuntu, Linux, whatever, and then just like keeps talking about chat forums. And that's it. Wow, okay, we have 2 minutes for questions. I'm amazed that. And then I'm not gonna actually read out everyone's names in the acknowledgements. there are a lot of acknowledgements in my thesis as well. Thanks to everyone who's here. Thanks to my family, thanks to my committee, thanks to Gabriel. Yeah, thanks guys.
Okay, so in typical Trenton style, I had suggested questions at the end, but he took questions along the way. So, but anyway, so if there are any other burning questions from the audience, please shout now. Otherwise, we'll invite people to get out and bombard him with questions from the committee members. Okay, so we have a question.
So I'm not sure this question even really makes sense, but when you have two sort of related memories that seem to kind of converge, like it's really hard to keep track of them and they kind of blend together, is the implication there that they're sort of like sharing a space in between the same neurons and activating like highly overlapping sets, and so they're like when you're reading the same neurons, and then if you could somehow up the number of neurons, would you get that feature splitting that you see in dictionary learning?
Yeah, I think that's right. Where like the more neurons you have, the more nuance you have in what's storing what. You also like, if the neurons are, normally you cluster things in the space, like chapter 2 talks about like being able to actually put similar things in similar parts of the space.
Okay.
Such that if there was a lot of overlap, they're probably kind of similar concepts. Maybe like 2 things within cooking, right? Instead of like Jennifer Aniston and like a fish or something. Yeah. But yeah, happy to go more into it. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you everyone. So I'll ask everybody to go out. We'll have more questions, and then later on, everybody's welcome to the kitchen in the 4th floor where there will be food.